Hello everyone and welcome back to the Great Book of Grudges. My name is Nathan and today we're going to talk about Warhammer Fantasy lore, but in the absolute strangest way possible. You see, a lot of the times when you mention Warhammer Fantasy, some smart aleck is going to say, well, Warhammer Fantasy is dead. A large campaign known as the End Times took care of that and led towards Age of Sigmar, which is the current main timeline. But notice that I say main timeline. That is because there are multiple timelines in Warhammer Fantasy, and it's something that doesn't really get explored a lot. The main timeline itself is known as Warhammer Fantasy 8th edition, the last timeline before the End Times and the last timeline before Age of Sigmar. This is something that might sound shocking considering that there's 7 other editions prior to that, but the timeline had already diverged by this point. So yeah, let's start diverting. We're not really going to stay in the 8th edition timeline as most of you watching this video are well versed with it. It's what we discuss, well, the majority of the time on this channel. The biggest diversion could be found in the 6th edition timeline. That was what I refer to as the golden age of Warhammer for the tabletop. So, 6th edition had its own massive end times-like scenario known as the Storm of Chaos. The Storm of Chaos, how it started, played out almost identically to the End Times. See, they were progressing the story as much as possible, and this campaign was a really cool supplement book which had some really interesting style armies. Not only that, loads of characters were dying. Characters that would have served larger purposes in the 8th edition timeline that we all know and love. And yeah, characters which would have been introduced in the End Times as a first-timer were actually introduced as a first-timer in the Storm of Chaos. A big character there being Volton, the Mary Sue of Warhammer Fantasy. So as it can be expected, Chaos did not win during this timeline. There were actually a few factors here, the biggest one being the Greenskins under Grimgor Ironhide, who had joined Archaon the Everchosen, got bored and decided to turn on Archaon, which, to be honest, yeah, sounds like Grimgor. Yeah, that's pretty much how it ends. It gets explored a little bit later, which we'll cover, but it was just really, really odd. But yeah, most of the known world had been destroyed by the forces of Chaos, and, well, they started to rebuild. A lot of characters were also killed off. The idea was to progress the story in a way that we've really not seen in Warhammer Fantasy, which had stayed stagnant for many, many years. This is another reason why Warhammer Fantasy was not doing so well. It's because, yeah, characters weren't dying, the story wasn't progressing. In fact, they would just keep going back to certain points, which is what happened later on. The 7th edition did also start to progress the story a little bit, the Nemesis Crown stuff, but eventually it was retconned or put on ice, and that's where we end up today in 8th edition. It was just a bit of a reset. Now, some people would say that this timeline was completely retconned, but there were certain points back in the day where some Games Workshop employees and some former ones would state that no, the Storm of Chaos was left as a alternate timeline, meaning that the door ajar is there, right? They can revisit it if they so wish. It's very important to note that Games Workshop never really actually remove anything permanently from the lore. This is why many editions later we can see the return of, say, the squats, for example. Not just the Leagues of Votann, but squats do exist in their proper form in Necromunda, or Malice, Malal, still getting mentions in newer canon as the Sons of Malice in the Warhammer 40k universe are still moving on. Or, even lately in Warhammer Fantasy, with the revival of the setting as Warhammer the Old World, we've been seeing Games Workshop mention half-orcs and centaurs, stuff which haven't existed since, I want to say, 3rd edition. So when it comes to Warhammer lore, I'd say nothing is really truly dead unless confirmed by Games Workshop themselves. Now, before we jump into other stuff, it's important to note that some things do carry over and just kind of ignore that the past happened. One of the big things here is actually the Gotrek and Felix series, which can be considered its own thing, but it did have previous timeline stuff and then just jumped into the modern stuff without really mentioning it, which is why some people who read over the books go, wait, wasn't this character dead? Or just general retcons coming into effect. It can be confusing, but it's still one of the best series that Games Workshop have ever released. Alright, let's keep progressing. So there was a novel at one point released known as Guardians of the Forest by Graham McNeill. This was centered around Athaloran, which, as we know, Athaloran has its own little timey-wimey stuff. But with this book, we find ourselves watching the story of Leofric Karad, a knight of Bretonnia who manages to go into a very weird part of the time ways. Athelloran has this weird font of power which can allow time and space to be bent in a random way, and this character found himself in Athelloran again, but 100 years later. So this would be around the year 2622, long after the supposed end times, long after the Storm of Chaos itself. And yeah, the book itself is still sold by Games Workshop, which is pretty interesting considering that it has a lot of canon conflicts. He is able to meet his past self, which could be assumed would be actually a different timeline version of himself rather than the past. If the whole lore of time travel still works here, I think it still works in the 40k setting. I'm not 100% too sure, but the idea is that you can't really interact with your past self or else you'll change something very dramatically in the future. Or they were just going like the Warcraft route where just nothing makes sense. But this is something quite important to note because obviously 100 years post Storm of Chaos, 100 years post End Times, there was clearly a plan to start introducing a multiverse, as we do know multiverses are actually a thing in Warhammer. What people don't know is that the Chaos Gods, the Chaos Demons, all the main Chaos stuff is actually one and the same between all the universes. This is why you see the Skull Cannons in Warhammer Fantasy when they're clearly more a 40k thing. There's demons like Skarbrand, which can be found in all the settings. It's because they're all part of the same universe. I'm not too sure about Age of Sigmar when it comes to that, but we're here. Yeah, it's this. Now, this timeline itself is actually quite interesting because our hero was known to have done a lot of damage here, even killing a Jade Dragon in Cafe, which is pretty interesting considering that we later found out, well, fairly recently, that the Jade Dragon is Yuan Bo, one of the dragon children. This is long before Cafe was properly fleshed out, and it's a little bit after the Storm of Chaos stuff, but I imagine that this could be counted as a sort of diversion, as Cafe isn't the Cafe that we actually know. The Dragon Emperor is some human rather than a primordial dragon celestial being type of thing. We still don't know exactly what the Dragon Emperor is. We know that he's an ancient dragon, but that's pretty much it. If anything, the most surprising thing about this book is that Games Workshop still sell it. It's an EPUB, so yeah, you can't get a physical hand copy anymore. But it's one of these things where, yeah, it's pretty curious. I actually kind of like the idea of time travel, and we're going to be talking about time travel a little bit later on in the video, because there's a few things even in the main timeline which we do need to discuss. Now, there's also Savant, which was a weird book. Let me just put it that way. It's kind of like a crime novel. This is kind of inspiration to what has led to some recent novels, obviously in the Warhammer franchise, both 40k, I think Age of Sigmar has a little bit too. A lot of people used to meme that this was basically just the Warhammer version of Pink Panther, but this was set in the year 2604, again, not during the end times. The world hadn't blown up. It's not a good book, I'll be honest with you. It's not great. But it does explore that in certain cases, yes, the world did not blow up, and it's important to talk about because it adds full story elements that we've actually seen in the future. And I'm not just talking about video games here, because obviously we have to take into account there's stuff like Age of Reckoning, Total War Warhammer, both of which have their own set timelines. Age of Reckoning, as far as I remember, ignored the whole Storm of Chaos storyline. There was no end times at that point, and what happened is it was its own thing. A plague swept through the land, the Chaos Warriors were starting to rise, we were getting the more traditional style of, well, kind of Storm of Chaos-y vibes, because obviously at that point we had seen the Chaos Warriors joining up with the Orcs and Goblins and even the Dark Elves. It's a pretty interesting story, which, to be honest, it's a massive shame that that MMO died. It was just badly handled. Thankfully, there's a lot of dedicated modders who have made their own private server and have kept it going. But yeah, this even had loads of tie-in books and short stories and stuff. There was a lot of actual lore for the Age of Reckoning timeline, which was also confirmed to be an alternate timeline by a developer of Mythic, I believe. So that's also quite important to note. When it comes to Total War Warhammer, it's loosely following 8th edition. The developers of the game constantly say they are firmly on 8th, but there's loads of characters that just weren't alive during 8th edition. You know, Rapunzel de Lyonesse, who is a few hundred years old. She should be dead by now. Not only that, but like Vlad von Karstein coming back and so on. There's a lot of changes there which really make it its own thing. And I feel like it's still going to hit towards the end time stuff. We actually already have a lot of end time stuff in the game, but it's one of these things where, yeah, it's a separate thing at this point. Now, here's the big thing. You might think that the Warhammer world, or the world that was, as it's called in Age of Sigmar, yeah, silly name, I know, proves that there's only one timeline, but there's actually been circumstances within the Age of Sigmar timeline where characters such as Gotrek, Teclis, and a few others, I'm assuming there will be more when eventually Malarion shows up, that's Malekith in his Age of Sigmar form, have been able to peer into realm gates and look to the Warhammer Fantasy world. However, the Warhammer Fantasy world is dead, which could mean that the realm gates are looking at separate timelines. I believe that this was also dabbled upon when it came into some story beats, where, yes, it was confirmed to be just a separate time. It wasn't their time. It's a very odd thing when referencing Age of Sigmar here, because the lore is still trying to find its footing. It still stays in the whole door ajar situation, but it's not really going to be the same. It's how, like, for example, the lizard men have changed from lizard men to like light demons and then back to lizard men. I don't know what the hell they are now. Everything's kind of linked with the whole multiverse stuff again. We've seen it again in a lot of Warhammer Fantasy. During the Storm of Chaos, you'd be able to get a chainsword, which was a nice little Easter egg. There's loads of Easter eggs there. There was also the thing of Khaldor Drago kind of showing up for a little bit during the end times. A lot of people are thinking, well, this might have been just a prelude to the Stormcast, but there have been Games Workshop staff going, no, this was actually just Drago. It was a little bit of a fun thing there, which kind of makes sense because obviously that was in the Chaos Realms, which are linked to everything, but then it's also the case of why... Mind you, the end times made no sense anyway. Now, it's important to note that time travel and alternate timelines could be easily explored in the Warhammer Fantasy world. For those not aware, Athaloran and Albion, two countries within the Warhammer Fantasy universe, are very strange when it comes to time. You could easily step into Athaloran or easily step into Albion and then come out and it's about 100 years later, 200 years later, 2 days later. It very much depends. You could be there for 1 second and then come out and the world has turned into turmoil because 50 years have passed and now there is a great orc invasion. Unfortunately, the lore has never really gone into detail regarding how this time travel usually works because it's been left in the most open way possible. It can be assumed that if you've been able to travel forward, then there are ways to travel back, unless it just knocks you into a separate timeline, where it just knocks you into the same place, just a completely different universe. Alternate timelines is something that Games Workshop have been trying to explore, but never really doing too well, and I feel like there could be an actual good time to do so now. If Warhammer the Old World does become quite successful, it could be possible to explore the Storm of Chaos timeline post-Asavar core stuff, and just work our way that way. It wouldn't devalue Age of Sigmar. The timeline that we know already got destroyed, so that would allow Age of Sigmar to continue, but, you know, bring in the Warhammer multiverse, which is something a lot of people have been asking for, especially since we're already expecting some sort of multiverse shenanigans, as, well, Henry Cavill's doing the whole TV show, that's going to make things get more popular. Multiverses are very big now for some reason, I don't know why, but, yeah, I mean, it's not out of the question. I feel like something like that could be doable. We just have to wait and see, I guess. But let me know what you guys think about alternate timelines in Warhammer. I haven't really gone over the 40k stuff because obviously I'm a primarily Warhammer Fantasy YouTuber, but there are a few circumstances. Yeah, let me know what you guys think in the comments below, and let's start a bit of discussion. Hope you guys are having a nice weekend, and I'll see you all again very, very soon. Have a good day.